The Shaping of Gondor, Part 2, The Line of Meneldil, Chapter 3, Lords and Priests. From Duvakil's submission to Turambar in 568 until the final 10 years of the reign of the latter's grandson Siriondil were 250 years of relative peace, both at home and beyond the borders of the realm. One might almost call it a renewal of the spring of Gondor, but for two things about the era. The characters of the men who sat the throne during that time, and the particularly bitter and fractious nature of the quarrels they took part in. Many of these were the residue of the 4.5 centuries preceding the Easterling invasion, mementos of the troubles swept under the rug by the East victors' quiescent predecessors. The two great points at issue were, whom was to be supreme in the kingdom in terms of law, and whom was to be her chief shepherd in spirit. The obeisance of Pelargir had made the first question moot, in name anyway, but that had been 7 centuries earlier, when memories of Sauron and Numenor were still fresh. Now, with no such looming threat, the long usage of provincial power and title, particularly among the high nobility, called to the arrogance of many among them towards the authority of the crown. The Ainatari of Cair meanwhile, had during the spring years been content to work hand in glove with the king, confident that their esteem was assured throughout the dominion by a citizenry united in the common worship of the Valar. By the close of Turambar's reign in 667, however, all that was changed. With the conquest of Rhovanion, Gondor had for the first time extended her rule over a people greatly different in culture and faith from those of the Seven Heartlands. Accordingly, many priests and acolytes of the Valar were dispatched from Cair almost from the moment of Duvakil's surrender. By and large, at first, the temple was given a free hand in this by the crown. The same could not be said of the lords. Turambar's wars of conquest in the east had strained the royal treasury nearly to the breaking point, and he left his son and successor, Atanatar, with a state that was almost bankrupt. This combined with a rebellion which broke out in Rhovanion almost immediately following Turambar's death and took until 673 to crush, forced the new king to dig for money in every possible quarter. Atanatar himself was no soldier, being drawn more to the legal and procedural side of things. He had, however, no shortage of self-assurance, so that he was to become known in some chronicles as Atanatar the Proud. Proud he may well have been as a man, but there is every reason to believe, given later events, that Atanatar's economizing policies were necessary and beneficial to the realm. Nevertheless, as taxes on both the Crondirs and the Demivirs were steadily increased throughout the 670s, the grumblings and objections of the great lords of the kingdom grew more and more vociferous. In 681, the four Crondirs, as well as the Demivir of Rhovanion, sent an angry petition to Osgiliath, demanding the repeal of the so-called Rhovanion tithe, citing the terms of the obeisance of Pelargir, which stipulated that no lord of the Stoneland would ever be compelled to pay more in tax or tithe than was expedient for him to part with. The king dismissed this, however, on the ground that the taxes accounted for a small percentage of the lord's wealth, and moreover that it was the place of the king, not the lords, to decide what constituted an expedient amount of tax. Atanatar's one concession was to agree to convoke a great council of the land to debate the subject. This council, held in 685, was the first since the time of Meneldil 6 centuries before. This second gathering, unfortunately, was nowhere near as fruitful. Although a few public building plans were confirmed, the lords remained staunchly opposed to the right of the king to tax them at will. The meeting adjourned with almost nothing resolved. 3 years later, tensions flared up again, when after a particularly bad harvest in Lebanon, its lord, together with those of Belfalas and Lambton, refused point-blank to enforce any further taxation of their domains by the crown. This, in Atanatar's view, was an open act of treason, and he promptly decreed all three to be deposed and their vassals freed from any obligation to obey them. A possible resolution came along when in 691 the Einitar Oronir offered to arbitrate the impasse, ultimately deciding in favor of the king and against the lords. The latter ignored this, though, dismissing the arbitration as the intrusive meddling of a cleric in matters which did not concern him. This, legally anyway, brought Gondor to the gravest constitutional crisis since the Long Rebellion, and that the situation did not devolve into outright civil war was due to two things. First, neither the king nor the lords were really financially capable of waging war against one another at this time. Secondly, new challenges emerged shortly after the Einatar's verdict that were to prove more than a distraction to both the king and his nobles, challenges which came from both the north and the south. Since the time of the last alliance, both Mordor and the inhabitants of the lands to the south and southeast, which had fought with her at the behest of Sauron, had lain quiet, giving little trouble to the kingdom of Gondor or its civilized subjects. The real threat had always come hitherto from Rhûn in the northeast, such as in the case of the Easterlings. In 698, however, all that came to a violent and abrupt end when the sea land of Umbar launched the first of what was to be many raids upon Gondor. In this first incursion, a fleet of 100 black Umbardrum ships fell upon an unsuspecting Pelargir, and it took 3 months of desperate and bloody resistance by the Pelargiri to repel them back into the Bay of Belfalas, with only 8 of their vessels intact. This siege had the effect of doing two things: displaying the military prowess of the Umbardrum, and demonstrating how perilously vulnerable the kingdom was towards the sea. Neither lesson was lost on Atanatar, and he quickly ordered plans drawn up for the construction of a royal navy to patrol the Bay of Belfalas and safeguard Gondor's ports from future raids. Had Atanatar succeeded in creating such a navy, it might have brought forwards the time of Gondorian imperial glory by a century and a half, but alas, the endeavor went nowhere. For even as the king and his ministers assessed and equivocated over the south, a new horizon was opening to the north. Ever since the reign of Romendikil, the fertile lands of Anorion and Ithilien had been growing overcrowded with tenant farmers, and available land for newcomers and enterprisers had become increasingly depleted. The opening of the vast new lands to the northeast in Rhovanion had brought some relief, but to prospective migrants used to the tame and gracious fields and climes of Anorion, the comparatively wild, hilly, and barbarous reaches of Rhovanion were a less than inviting prospect. Across the Anduin from Rhovanion, and just to the north of the White Mountains, however, was the land known to the Gondorians as Calenardhon. Stretching a good 500 leagues from the Anduin to the Angren River, it consisted of immense flat plains well suited for both farms and horse breeding, much like Rhovanion. Unlike Rhovanion, however, it was almost unpopulated at the time of Turambar's eastern invasion, and from about that time onward it became a favored settling destination for Gondorian's second sons and daughters. By Turambar's death in 667 there were perhaps 50,000 there. By the time of the siege of Pelargir in Atanatar's reign, that number had increased to 100,000. It did not take long for the forever money-conscious king to recognize the potential rich rewards that might proceed from Calenardhon's absorption into the realm, and from about the year 700 on, Atanatar's and his ministers' attention became more and more focused upon the north. Tax reprieves were offered to subjects who relocated to farmsteads in Calenardhon. Roads were constructed, forts, and townships were established and garrisoned at the king's behest. The great tower fortress of Angrenost was meticulously refurbished and re-garrisoned for the first time since the days of Isildur and Anarion. The result of these labors was that by 712 the land was sufficiently populated and consolidated to be made into a formal province, and in Urme of that year Atanatar appointed a demivir to oversee it in the king's name, just as Turambar had done in Rhovanion a century earlier. And so it was that Gondor gained yet another large territory, save this time without war or bloodshed. Indeed, some in time came to refer to Calenardhon as the Eighth Heartland, in equality to the original 7, in recognition of its longevity and eminence within the realm. To be sure, not all was sweetness and light in the latter years of Atanatar's rule. In 740, Umbar, having recovered from her repulse at the mouth of the Anduin 45 years earlier, decided to try again, and this time assaulted not only Pelargir, but also the port city of Linhir, on the mouth of the river Gilrain, 100 miles to the west. This time, however, the defenders were better prepared, and then a timely series of storms swept in from the Bay of Belfalas and severely damaged the Umbardrum fleets. Both sieges were broken in a matter of weeks, and the corsairs, chastened once more, sued for peace and slunk back to the south coast. The legal controversy with the lords also dragged on pointlessly during these years. The duties and taxes raised from the newly gained provinces of Rhovanion and Calenardhon had, by the latter portion of Atanatar's reign, somewhat alleviated the necessity of taxing the Crondiers to the hilt, and few of the small farmers who lived under them had any desire to war against their king merely to save their landlords a few gold coins. So the issue lingered in legal limbo for decades. Then, in 745, Ulirion, the lord of Amphalas, the largest Crondir fief, died, and was succeeded by a son more amenable to the crown. Still Belfalas and Lebanon, smaller but richer and more populous, continued to assert their prerogatives. 3 years later, Atanatar died as well, after a reign of 81 years. Atanatar the Proud is chiefly remembered by most histories for three events: the War of the Lords, the Umbardrum raids, and the colonization of Calenardhon. In all three he was largely successful. Although Umbar would be a thorn in the side of the Winged Helm for millennia, their defeat at the hands of his captains redounds to his credit, and his attempts to assemble a navy served as a foundation for his later successors. Likewise, the power of the Crondiers would continually weaken as well from this time onward, and eventually all of the Crondir fiefdoms would be abolished and absorbed under the power of the White Throne, and Calenardhon would remain an invaluable part of the Gondorian realm for 18 centuries thereafter, long outlasting the more flamboyant exploits of the East victors in Rhovanion. A hard-working, conscientious, if inglorious monarch, Atanatar was respected if not loved by his subjects. At the king's funerary ceremony in Minas Anor, the Einitar Cothalion is said to have remarked to a member of the officiating retinue, "Had he been the master of a counting house, he would have been the cheerier." There was, however, to be little cause for cheer during the reign of Atanatar's successor Siriondil. The 82-year rule of the 11th king of Gondor presents something of a challenge to the dedicated and impartial chronicler. On the one hand, there are few rulers in the Stoneland's history more pious and personally virtuous, yet equally few as remote, aloof, and unknowable. Then, too, as with the kings of the Spring of Gondor, there are large murky holes in the flow of events during his time on the White Throne. From 750 to 780 the chronicles tell us practically nothing. Between 790 and 806, likewise, the picture is blank. Siriondil had not been born to the throne. An older brother had died in a mishap while hunting in South Ithilien in 702. This tragedy apparently shook the new young heir grievously in both mind and spirit, and he spent much of his time from then onward in the company of clerics, mystics, and minstrels on Caer Andros, and this too shaped the character of the future monarch. It would appear that his father, Atanatar, had had little time for him during these years, or patience, if he had had the time, being preoccupied with the ordering of the new northern lands in Calenardhon, as well as his squabbles with the lords. Thus, upon his accession in 748, no king of Gondor, not even Enardil the Silent, was less well known or familiar to his people. Although in his own time admired by some for his zealous devotion to the Valar, and referred to by some as Siriondil the Soothsayer, or alternately Siriondil the Seer, in my own opinion, Siriondil the Wilfully Oblivious would be a more befitting title, given his manner of kingship. The unusual and aloof tone of the new reign was demonstrated almost from the start, when Siriondil decreed that he would hold his court not in Osgiliath, but in the much older elven port haven of Elthaland, 300 leagues to the west. Many elven inhabitants still dwelt there, and the starry-eyed king undoubtedly was attracted by the idea of surrounding himself with the firstborn of Eru. In addition, a large number of priests, particularly of the sect of Varda, would sit on his council. With these were spent much of his time when not dealing with matters of state. In truth, in contrast with his ministerial father and warlike grandfather and great-grandfather, Siriondil seemed singularly uninterested in the affairs of the kingdom, or in the wider happenings of Middle-earth. In 750, for instance, emissaries from King Elendur of Arnor arrived in Ethelon to plead for military aid. Arnor had always been a poorer and less populous realm than her sister kingdom to the south, and her strength, unlike that of Gondor, had been steadily waning since the War of the Last Alliance. A series of natural disasters, political conflicts resulting from the random accession of a number of child monarchs, as well as the slow depletion of manpower, had all worked against her, and now, 7 centuries after the death of her founder Elendil, she was rapidly disintegrating. Siriondil, however, received the emissaries with supreme indifference, before offering a half-hearted promise to send aid as soon as matters permitted. All Elendur eventually got, a couple of years later, were a few archers and a number of rickety, barely seaworthy hulks. As said before, the early portion of Siriondil's reign is a fog. Only in 780 does the mist clear, and only in connection with a certain Kalkar, or Pelakar, depending upon the account. A low-born commoner from Anfalas, the westernmost of Gondor's provinces, he arrived in Ethelond in 780, and swiftly caught the attention of the lugubrious monarch with his divine pronouncements and claims of spiritual communion with the Valar. From this time on, the king fell more and more under the self-proclaimed prophet's influence, awarding him many fine castles and estates, and even elevating him to the office of steward of the realm. This was disturbing enough to both court and populace, but complicating the situation further was the Einitar, Culthalion. He was an imperious, arrogant man who resented Palkar's increasing spiritual role in the life of the king and court. When in 782 he demanded that the sage be banished for preaching false prophecies, the king sullenly overruled him. Then in 788, at his steward's urging, Siriondil proclaimed that henceforth he would make the traditional midsummer offering to Yavanna at the Hallow of the Giving Sun in Minas Anor, in place of the Einitar, as well as taking over other roles usually reserved for Cair Andros. This was too much. Culthalion publicly denounced the king and steward as being out of line and placing the entire kingdom at risk of divine displeasure. Siriondil might have ignored this too, but for the fact that many of the great lords, as well as a good number of the common people, supported the priestly thunders. Reluctantly, at his advisor's urging, in 790 he convoked the Council of Gondor, as his father Atanatar had done a century earlier. And as before, it achieved precisely nothing. Culthalion, who attended, invoked the full force of supernatural retribution should he be supplanted as spiritual shepherd, whilst Steward Palkar waxed arcane in defense of the truth of his visions. The gathering dispersed in complete confusion and indecision. Culthalion continued to take his customary place at the altars, whilst Siriondil, for his part, proceeded to avoid public appearances almost entirely from 790 onward, rarely leaving his sanctum in Ethelond. Another lost period follows, stretching from the close of the Third Council up to 806. Culthalion died that year, and was succeeded on the swan chair by Clemon, an even more stalwart figure, and if relations had been poor up till now between king and high priest, it was nothing to what happened next. In 811, Siriondil's beloved queen, Idrel, died from illness. Like Anardil the Silent, the king erected a lavish monument to her in Osgiliath. Unlike Anardil, however, he elected to remarry, and in 812 quietly took to wife a certain Durnedel of Calonbel. There was one small problem with this. Durnedel was lowborn, and the Code of Inzelthon expressly forbade marriage between the Anarioni and any outside the noble houses of Numenor. Clemon almost immediately condemned the union as both illegal and sacrilegious, joined by a number of the great lords and ladies who resented being made to bow before a common merchant's daughter. Siriondil, however, was firm, and obstinately refused to renounce her on the grounds of dynastic exigency, proclaiming all who questioned Durnedel's legitimacy as a renegade and traitor to the crown. None of the nobility were quite willing to plunge the land into rebellion, or worse, simply over a distasteful marriage, and in the end Siriondil kept his queen. Nevertheless, it was an embarrassing blot on the crown's standing among both the priesthood and the nobility, and not since Osterher had a king of Gondor been so unloved by his subjects. To add to all these ignominies were the problems brewing outside the borders. All throughout the controversies concerning priestly prerogatives and internal politics, the foreign peace had been precariously maintained. Although Atanatar's ill-starred efforts to build a standing navy had floundered, many of the great port cities, Pelargir, Linhir, Ethelond, Angard, had taken the initiative and built small provincial fleets, and these had played a part in preventing more raids on the scale of those in 698 and 740. The tide could not be held back forever, though, and in 820 the dam finally broke when the south suddenly flared with raiding assaults. Every port of any size on the Bay of Belfalas was struck by Umbardrum corsair flotillas, some of them visiting untold destruction and pillage on the local inhabitants. By 825 the black sails of Umbar were even penetrating as far north as the city of Kellumbel and Lambden. So devastating were these incursions that a prayer began to become common on the coastal regions. To dark Ulmo drown our foes, and fell Umbar where our bounty goes. To the east, too, pressure was building, as the Easterling tribes south of the Sea of Rhun began to stir and launch raiding parties into the border settlements of Rhovanion. The tranquility which had prevailed since Turambar's invasion 2 centuries before was breaking up, and Gondor was becoming beset by enemies both east and south. It might have seemed to her people at the time that the kingdom, hamstrung as she was by her priestly feuds and her hapless recluse king, was on the verge of catastrophe, and that all the work of Ermendikil, Turambar, and Atanatar was soon to be undone. But that was not to be. As it happened, another conquering prince was at hand, one whose accomplishments would outshine even those of the East victors, and usher in the most glorious age of Gondor's history.